heart, and I found myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal. And that time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do, in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony. But we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision. But we must speak. And we must rejoice as well, for surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us. If it is, let us trace its movements and pray that our own inner being may be sensitive to its guidance. For we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us.
Greetings. What gilagats to yung gets? What scalewage? Acquisasne genuini nidoageno, tanaganyet gahaga, hudanoshoni genigia dodo. I come tonight to do the opening and to do the words before all else. Upon these lands, these indigenous lands, we predate the Confederation of the United States. And so, in this opening, I'd like to offer gratitude to all of creation, beginning with all you lovely people here tonight, and to our Mother Earth, to the waters, to the fishes, to the grasses, to the plant life, the berries, our sacred women deities, the corn, beans, and the squash, to the animal life, to the bug life, to the tree life, and on high, the bird life, especially our sacred eagle. And I also turn my thoughts and my gratitude toward the sky, and I remember the four winds, our grandfather thunders, our brother the sun, our grandma the moon, the stars, the four sacred beings, our sacred sky woman who began this earth, and to our Creator, her grandson. So with these words, I open this night, and I acknowledge the indigenous nations that lived upon this land, and especially the Manhattoes, who are part of the Delaware Confederacy upon this church is built. And I also remember my people who made many contributions to the frameworks and to the confederation of this country, not just this one, but also of Canada. And also I share some wisdom from one of our medicine men back home, and it's about being in the medicine of time and how important it is to recognize this wonderful transition that we're in the awakened spirit. And so we remember this day, unlike the Gregorian calendar, we follow the celestial moon and remember the day deities, the medicines that time brings us. The plumed serpent. This is a day of strict impartial justice, a day of definition and maturity, and a good day to offer respect and to thank the corn. On this day, matters of justice, judges, and courts can be remediated. This is a good day to pray that truth and justice are manifested in the heart of the sky and the heart of the earth. It's a good day to put aside jealousies and request equilibrium in life and in the family. It is a good day to ask for physical strength and patience to contemplate our spiritual evolution and to rekindle the internal fire. So as we commemorate and celebrate the life and the work of Martin Luther King and the speech that he made here, and I'm so honored to be here at Riverside, I ask you to put in also your memory and to commemorate the lives of the indigenous peoples of this land that were ethnically cleansed in order for westward expansion to begin. And for all of you to have the freedoms that you enjoy today. Many of my people died, and they were written out of history. So I ask you, rekindle that eternal fire and help return the indigenous people to the ranks of humanity. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Good evening and welcome this evening to the Nave of the historic Riverside Church. I'm Amy Butler, I'm the senior minister, and it's my honor to welcome you here this evening to our holy space on what is really a momentous day. 50 years since Martin Luther King Jr. stood just here and delivered one of the most powerful and consequential speeches, sermons of his entire career. You all know what happened to him after he delivered this address, which was advised against by many, many people who were working with him. What you may not know is that some students from Union Theological Seminary had invited Dr. King to come and speak. And when he came, having thought for 2 years or so about saying what he said, there were so many people who wanted to hear what he had to say that the speech was moved here into this space. So here we are tonight, gathered together, and I want to say a very special thank you to our partners tonight, Iliff School of Theology, Veterans of Hope, Union Theological Seminary, and of course, Ruby Sales and Michelle Alexander. Thank you for your partnership and for making tonight possible for all of us. Tonight, this weekend at the Riverside Church, we are kicking off an entire year devoted to celebrating this speech and the work of Dr. King. Today is exactly 1 year to the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, which will be next year in 2018. We will have events here all throughout the year. You can find out more about those events at www.beyondthedream50.org. Hope that you will join us many times over the course of this year as we are calling for justice and peace. One of our goals is to get these incredible voices outside the walls of this church, and so we have some partners around the country who are joining us via live stream tonight. We particularly welcome Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte and Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas. We're glad to extend this conversation out across the country. We'll be doing a short question and answer after Michelle and Ruby's conversation, and so think about a question that you might want to ask. You can tweet it with the hashtag BeyondTheDream50, or you can raise your hand in the old-fashioned way and we'll have some microphones. Again, thank you so much for being here tonight. We hope that you feel the warm welcome of this community of faith as we listen and are inspired again by these words.
Good evening, everyone. I was in church here on Sunday, and I know you can do some call and response. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I am Tom Wolf, president of the Iliff School of Theology in Denver. On behalf of Iliff, I am honored to welcome everyone here and all who are joining us by live stream as we reflect on the state of our nation's soul in light of Dr. King's prophetic witness in his Beyond Vietnam speech. I'm grateful to this great congregation at Riverside Church, its senior minister, Reverend Dr. Amy Butler, and the Riverside staff for their hospitality and partnership in this 50th anniversary observance that comes at a critical time in our nation's history. A year and a half ago, I felt a call to have Iliff and Riverside Church honor the deeply human connection between Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Dr. Vincent Gordon Harding. Around this speech and the relationship to its words. The late Dr. Harding served on the Iliff faculty for more than 2 decades. He came to us having been an advisor to Dr. King and a servant of the civil rights movement. He served Iliff as he did the movement, building on the school's core commitment to embody social justice. He awakened in our students a hunger to become leaders who possess courageous theological imaginations, and how we remember his words. Now you know better, you do better. And how they continue to reverberate within the hearts of all whom he taught. While at Iliff, he founded the Veterans of Hope Project, now celebrating 20 years. And many of the veterans are present with us this evening. We are humbled by your presence, and we are grateful for their central role in this collaboration. Dr. King, knowing that they were of the same heart and mind, asked Dr. Harding to draft for him a speech to condemn the war in Vietnam, but more than that, a speech that would declare a prophetic word to the nation that the same injustice that was and remains the focus of the civil rights movement was playing out on an international scale, particularly through the travesty that was the war in Vietnam. Both agreed it was time that, quote, we as a nation undergo a radical revolution of values, unquote. When I think about their relationship, I imagine the beautiful support in which they held each other as one was about to speak the hard word. So it is time for us to reunite the spirit and essence of these two courageous souls who continue to call us to, quote, recapture the revolutionary spirit, and go out into the sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism, unquote. This evening, we commemorate a defining moment that disturbed the nation and, quote, exposed a far deeper malady within the American spirit, unquote. So let us be clear. We are not here to remember only an isolated historical moment. We are here to let these words rouse the life force in our own spirits. We are here to claim again the inclusive vision of this speech as it stands in tension with the exclusive actions of a current administration. We are here to say never again to the aggressive rhetoric that emboldens people to act out against their neighbors. We are here to set free in us the speech's original power to say never again each time we hear America first roll far too easily from the tongues of our leaders. May it generate within us a renewed call to a deeper humanness and in its own words, a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all humankind. In that spirit, welcome this evening.
Remember me. Remember me. Oh, remember me. I'm your child. Remember me. I'm your child. Remember me. Remember me. Remember me. We don't really think about how young Martin Luther King was while he did most of his work. He seems like an ancient being now, a huge intergalactic transportation for humanity. I'm working on an opera by Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, and I just see everything as universal and timeless. And so it's hard to remember how many years, Earth years, people like Martin Luther King spent getting really great at what they were doing. And he is gone, but I have my mom still with me. And I look at her sometimes and I think about what she did before she was 21. And my mind is blown. It's good to look at these young people now as our guide. It's good to look at these young people now as our guide. It's good to look at these young people now as our guide, because they are saying something different from what Martin Luther King said, because they're speaking to their era. They're saying something different than James Baldwin. They're speaking to their era, and they're gathering up all of the medicine from those people and putting it into a line which is useful for our now. They're not even trying to think about Democrats and Republicans and capitalism and holding these old things. They want something else. And so it is good to think about what these young people are doing now. If you don't have any young people, you have to go borrow some. Sword and shield way down, way down, way down. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield way down. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study. I ain't gonna study. Okay, you almost there. You almost there, but it's just a little cap on how far we can actually go that is about to be respected. And I would like the cap to not be respected. In fact, I would like it to be ignored. In fact, the only thing I would like to do on this song is call out the verses, and then you kind of take it away. So I'm wondering if we can just elevate to that place and not have to make a gradual climb slowly over the 3 minutes that this song is gonna take. And it's important that you elevate in a room like this, because the ceiling is high and we just bouncing all over the place. You might not, you know what I'm saying? So I'm just gonna start. The verses are gonna be lay down the sword and shield, join hands the whole world round. On that one, you might stop clapping and actually join hands or touch each other. If you don't like to be touched, don't do that. The last one is gonna be, I'm gonna lay down my burden, because you know we need to lay down our burdens to get anything done around here. Self-care is important, and we might do the first one again depending on where we at, okay? I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield way down. Hey, way down, way down. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield way down. Ain't gonna study war no more. You're allowed to stand up and do what you need to. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study. I ain't gonna study. I ain't gonna study. It's the band. I say freedom if you call my name. Oh, I wonder, could you call again and I'll answer. Call again and I'll answer. I don't think we met before. I heard some old folks talking about you like you were the Lord. Call again and I'll answer. Call again and I'll answer. I say freedom, you must live up amongst the stars. Kinda hard in a world like ours. We talk about you night and day. Oh, we're thinking we might find a way. Freedom over here. Oh, I know it's not always clear. Some of us, we've had our fill. Who's gonna stand up with you? I will. Oh, you sound like someone we really need. Soul-searching armies looking for a victory. Call again and I'll answer. I will. Call again and I'll answer. We lost our water from hunger and greed, but I can cry you a river of hunger and need. Call again and I'll answer. Call again and I'll answer. I say freedom, you must live up amongst the stars. It's kinda hard in a world like ours. We think about you night and day. Oh, we're thinking we might find a righteous way. Freedom over here. Oh, I know it's not always clear. Some of us, we've had our fill. Who's gonna stand up with you? I will. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, they trying to build more and more. They don't even know what they building for. Call again and I'll answer. Call again and I'll answer. Freedom to have air to breathe. Freedom to walk the land beneath your feet. Call again and I'll answer. Call again and I'll answer. We think about you night and day. We thinking we might find a way, but who's gonna make a sacrifice? Who's gonna live for what is right? Who's gonna make room in this circle of ours? Who's gonna bring you home from the stars? Who's gonna believe that love is real? Who's gonna stand up for you? Who's gonna stand up with you? Who's gonna stand up with you? I will. Yeah. I will. Yeah.
reading from Beyond Vietnam. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs reconstructing.
A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say, "This is not just." It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of South America and say, "This is not just." The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just.
A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say of war, "This way of settling differences is not just." This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's home with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death.
America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering the priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war. There is nothing to keep us from molding a recalcitrant status quo with bruised hands until we have fashioned it into a brotherhood. We must, with positive action, seek to remove these conditions of poverty, insecurity, and injustice, which are the fertile soil in which the seed of communism grows and develops.
These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wounds of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the land are rising up as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. We in the West must support these revolutions.
It is a sad fact that because of comfort, complacency, a morbid fear of communism, and our proneness to adjust to injustice, the Western nations that initiated so much of the revolutionary spirit of the modern world have now become the arch anti-revolutionaries. This has driven many to feel that only Marxism has a revolutionary spirit. Therefore, communism is a judgment against our failure to make democracy real and follow through on the revolutions that we initiated.
Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and unjust mores, and thereby speed the day when every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. Amen.
Good evening. I'm Gloria Smith.
And I'm Rachel Harding. And on behalf of the Veterans of Hope Project, we also welcome you and thank you for coming from all across the nation to be with us tonight in this sacred place.
Before Rachel introduces our speakers, I'd like to recognize a few of our special guests and sponsors. We have with us tonight Reverend James Peters of Denver. He's one of our Veterans of Hope. Reverend Peters worked closely with Dr. King in Connecticut and Boston. We also have the wife of Bob Moses, Janet Moses, is with us. And of course, Ruby is one of our veterans. We'll get to hear from Ruby a little later. And Michelle is a newcomer. She's a new veteran of Hope. I'd like to also recognize Bernice Johnson Reagan. She's not here tonight, but her daughter Toshi did a wonderful job with the music. I'd like to recognize just a few friends of the Veterans of Hope Project. We have with us tonight the family of Ruby Sales and Nancy and Cheryl. And we also have Amy Billingsley, who's a dear friend of the project. And we have other friends too, and I recognize you all. I'm not going to go through all the names, but we thank you for being here, all of you. I'd like to also recognize some of the sponsors of this event. First, the Ikeda Center. We have Mr. Richard Yoshimashi here with us tonight from Cambridge. Cleo Parker Robinson Dance in Denver is also a co-sponsor. And the Black Star Project and the Young Black Men of Honor in Chicago were co-sponsors. I'd like to thank Dr. Tom Wolfe and the Ileff School of Theology staff. I'd also like to thank Reverend Amy Butler and the Riverside Church staff. And I'd like to thank, yes. Great job, thank you. And I'd like to thank Dr. Serene Jones. I don't know if she's here tonight, but I'd like to thank her and the Union Theological Seminary staff. I'd also like to thank our planning team, and they're sort of spread throughout the sanctuary tonight, the Nave tonight, and they are Rachel Johnson. Rachel's somewhere walking around. Rachel Johnson and Bertram Johnson, both of Riverside Church. Sue Bing Yep, and Karen Ware Joseph, and Aaron Christensen from the Ileff School of Theology. I believe they're here tonight. But I'd also like to recognize a young lady. Her name is Allison Wisniewski. Allison was one of the co-chairs of this event and couldn't be with us tonight because of the passing of her mom. So I'd just like to do a special thank you to Allison. And then finally, I'd like to thank the family of Dr. King, Reverend Bernice King, regrets that she couldn't be with us tonight, but she sends well wishes to all of you. And I'd like to recognize the family of Dr. Harding, Dr. Vincent Harding. He has some cousins who live in New York who are with us tonight. I'd like to recognize his widow, El Josie, and her daughter, Ayana. I don't know where they're sitting, but just thank you. And then we have the Freeney Harding family who's visiting from Chicago, Las Vegas, Houston, and other places. Jean, Joanne, Marissa, and Dr. Rachel Harding, who is Dr. Harding's daughter.
Ruby Nail Sales and Michelle Alexander are with us tonight because they are part of a lineage, and because in this national moment, we urgently need to be reminded of the wisdom, the courage and incisive critique, the deep searching and the profound love in that lineage. That lineage is what activists William L. Patterson and Ann Braden called the other America. It is a long line of women and men from many communities in the nation who have nurtured a healing vision of what we can and must become as a just, humane, multiracial democracy. This is the lineage that Martin and Coretta King and so many of the veterans of the Southern Freedom Movement were a part of. And the stories of that lineage are the stories that my parents, Vincent and Rosemarie Freeney Harding, were profoundly committed to sharing in their roles as teachers, historians, writers, and encouragers. It is the lineage of James and Grace Lee Boggs, of Yuri Kochiyama, of Corky Gonzalez and Gloria Anzaldúa, of Vine Deloria and Malcolm X and Betty Shabazz. It is the lineage of Fannie Lou Hamer and the countless other ancestors of our beautiful struggle, on whom we call to guide our listening and our speaking, our sharing together of the concerns of our hearts for the well-being of our suffering, beloved nation. Ruby Sales and Michelle Alexander are in this lineage. Ruby Sales is a woman of keen warrior spirit, of machete-sharp intellect and gentle heart. This powerful combination of attributes led her into the Southern Freedom Movement as a teenager at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where she joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and worked in voter registration in Lowndes County. And it has kept her firmly on the battlefield for over 50 years, fighting for the most righteous, compassionate, and inclusive community we can imagine and create. A graduate of Manhattanville College, and Episcopal Divinity School, Sales is a respected social critic and long-standing public theologian. She is the founder and director of the national nonprofit organization, the Spirit House Project, based in Atlanta, Georgia, whose work centers racial and social justice in the context of spiritually grounded community building and the mentorship of young people. Years before anyone knew of Michael Brown, Rekia Boyd, or Eric Garner, Ruby Sales had her ears attuned to the muffled genocidal warnings from Black mothers all over the South and the North, whose children were being murdered before their eyes and behind their backs. Drawing on the multiple layers of her wisdom, the ministering wisdom, the mothering wisdom, the scholarly wisdom, the organizing wisdom, the mystic wisdom, Ruby brought together a committed cohort who joined her in a searing, persistent call for the mattering of Black lives in the USA. Since 2007, SAILS has worked to expose the state-sanctioned deaths of African Americans by police, security guards, and white vigilantes, compiling a national database on the atrocities, offering spiritual and organizational support to families, and coordinating teach-ins, forums, press conferences, and community meetings across the nation. In March of last year, SAILS and the Spirit House Project organized a National Day of Action in Washington, D.C., with the theme, Stop the War on Our Children, during which women from around the country gathered to acknowledge young victims of state-sanctioned violence with a silent procession from the White House to the U.S. Capitol, a public hearing hosted by Dr. Wilmer Leon, and the delivery of caskets containing the names of victims to key Senate, House, and Supreme Court leadership. Also last year, SAILS was featured in an extended interview on the role of religion in U.S. public life on the NPR program On Being with Krista Tippett. Ruby Sell's work has been documented by scholars of the civil rights movement, and she has received awards and honors for her labors, including the Beautiful Are Their Feet Award and the Living Legacies Civil Rights Recognition from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, the Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Award from the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and an honorary doctorate from the Westchester University in Pennsylvania. She's a model and a mentor to many in the grand and blessed work of long-distance running in the movement for freedom and justice in our nation, and we are thankful for her witness, her fire, and her foresight. Michelle Alexander is a legal scholar, educator, and activist who came to national prominence in 2010 with the publication of her magnificent and widely acclaimed book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Historian David Levering Lewis said of Alexander's text, quote, "After reading The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's stunning work of scholarship, one gains the terrible realization that for people of color, the American criminal justice system resembles the Soviet Union's Gulag. The latter punished ideas, the former punishes a condition," unquote. Ms. Alexander's book has been perhaps the single most catalytic writing in the current national debate about the crisis and mass incarceration in our nation. It is widely read in college and university courses, advocacy trainings, community reading groups, and faith-based study circles. Ms. Alexander has been featured on national radio, television, and online media, and she's written for publications that include the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Nation, and the Huffington Post. A graduate of Vanderbilt University and the Stanford Law School, Michelle Alexander clerked for Justice Harry Blackmun on the U.S. Supreme Court and for Chief Judge Abner Mikva on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. She taught civil rights law at Stanford Law School and at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University, where she held a joint appointment at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. She's now visiting professor at the Union Theological Seminary and is currently exploring the moral and spiritual implications of mass incarceration, as well as the resources for prophetic advocacy and movement building across faiths, races, and cultures. Prior to her work in academia, Alexander served as the director of the Racial Justice Project of the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California. It was in those years that she began to awaken to the reality that our nation's criminal justice system functions, as she says, more like a caste system than a system of crime prevention or control. She became passionate about exposing and challenging racial bias, ultimately leading a major campaign against racial profiling known as the DWB, Driving While Black or Brown campaign. Alexander's path-breaking work has earned her significant recognition, including the Soros Justice Fellowship an NAACP Image Award, and a Ford Foundation Senior Fellowship. The dedication, determination, and prophetic vision of our speakers inspire and push us in equal measure toward more courage, more hope, more community, and more life. We are glad they are with us, and we look forward to hearing their dialogue.
Good evening. I am so glad to be here tonight. I am beyond grateful to have the opportunity to participate in this dialogue with a woman I deeply admire, Ruby Sales, about a subject that I believe this is the most important conversation we could possibly be having at this moment in our nation's history. It is. And I do want to thank all those who helped to make this event possible, especially Rachel Harding for inviting Ruby and I into dialogue. It's an honor to be here with you, Ruby, and I'm eager to dive into our dialogue, but before we get started, I want to just spend a few minutes providing a bit of historical background and context for this sermon, for those who are in the audience as well as those who are watching elsewhere via live stream. I know many people in this audience were not alive when this sermon was delivered, and for those of you who were on the planet, you may not remember it very well, or at least not some of the details which made this moment in history such an extraordinary and complex moment in time. We are here tonight because 50 years ago today, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to a podium right here in Riverside Church and delivered a sermon that he knew would rock the world and lead to a wave of condemnation and vilification by many of his friends and close political allies. He did. The sermon that he gave that day is rarely mentioned on the national holiday that is named in his honor. It's rarely mentioned during Black History Month, and yet it seems fair to say that 50 years later, it is this sermon that has proved the most prophetic. It is this sermon, far more than the I Have a Dream speech, that speaks most directly to the current moral and political crises that we face today. Yes. This speech delivered in April 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination. And at the time he delivered this speech, there was a horrific war raging in Vietnam, and it had been raging for years. American soldiers were returning home in caskets, and these images were broadcast on the evening news. Our military began using napalm, chemical warfare, on women, children, entire villages. Bombs containing napalm dropped on villages, and photographic images of women and children burning alive, running from their villages, were being circulated around the globe. During the Vietnam War, 8 million tons of bombs were dropped on that small country, all in the name of fighting communism. A peace movement was growing and surging in the United States, and some clergy were beginning to speak out. Pressure had been building on King to speak by those in the peace movement, and many young activists like Stokely Carmichael began to pressure King to speak out. You've got to break your silence. Even Muhammad Ali had taken his stand. He announced that as a Muslim, he was a conscientious objector, and that he would rather go to jail than fight that war. He famously said, quote, "No Vietnamese ever called me a nigger. They never lynched me. They didn't put no dogs on me. They didn't rob me of my nationality, rape and kill my mother and father. Shoot them for what? How can I shoot those poor people? Just take me to jail." And still King remained silent. King actually wanted to break his silence years earlier, but members of his inner circle, many of his closest friends and advisors, said no, begged him not to. They were afraid. They knew what the response would be. They knew there would be a vicious backlash, that he would be cast as a communist and as a traitor, and it would be an enormous setback for a movement that was really just beginning. Civil rights leaders didn't want King criticizing President Lyndon Johnson. It was the last thing they wanted. For many of them, Johnson had been the best president black people ever had. He signed the Voting Rights Act, the civil rights legislation, and he was promising to be an ally in the fights to come. What kind of madness, many of them said, would lead you to antagonize the president who has been a friend to black people, who just signed the civil rights legislation we've been fighting for and some of us died for? And so when King stepped to the podium here in Riverside Church, he began his speech by saying, "I am here tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice." And Dr. Vincent Harding was given the task of drafting the speech, a man who, I have to say, became a dear friend to me in the last years of his life. He's a man whose spiritual and moral depth rivals anyone I have ever known. And this sermon that he drafted with King could have merely taken issue with the Vietnam War, but it went much, much further, challenging the greed and imperialism of American empire and calling out the United States government as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. The entire sermon is grounded in King and Harding's deeply held spiritual belief that Vietnamese children were children of God, no less than American children, and no less than the young black men who were being drafted and sent to kill them. Every effort was made to ensure that this message would actually be heard by people of faith and conscience around the world. A decision was made that this message would not be delivered at a huge protest and march that was going to be occurring 10 days later at the United Nations. There was fear that if he were to deliver his remarks there, that they would get mixed up in the angry crowd and the political messaging, and that the message would be corrupted or lost or distorted and confused in the media. And so Dr. King and his advisor said, we need to give this speech at Union, at Riverside, in a place of worship. The next day, 168 newspapers denounced him, and President Johnson disinvited him from the White House. The New York Times called the speech wasteful and self-defeating. The Washington Post said that Dr. King had done a discredit to himself, to his people, to his country, and that he would no longer be a respected man in America. And the American public turned against him. The last poll taken in his life, the Harris poll, found that 3/4 of the American people had turned against King on this issue, including a majority of black folks. Now, I encourage all of you who are here tonight to read the sermon, to read the whole thing. Read it at least twice, And then ask yourself whether or not this exact same sermon could be delivered today with even greater force and resonance. We might need to change a few words, change Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. Might need to tweak it here or there, but I believe that speech, that sermon has more resonance today than it did 50 years ago when it was delivered. And if that's true, I think that tonight in our conversation, we have to ask ourselves what we must do now to build that global revolution that Dr. King insisted was overdue 50 years ago. Now I want to turn to Ruby Sales and give her a chance to frame this moment for us. Ruby, you were alive back then. I wasn't born yet, but you were not only alive, but you were an activist already. You were a teenager, putting yourself and your life on the front lines of this movement. At the time this sermon was delivered, you had already been arrested for nonviolent, direct action protesting segregation. You participated in a march after you were released from jail, where a white supremacist threatened your life, pointed a gun at you, and a white seminary student pushed you out of the way and took the bullet that was intended for you and died. And the killer of that young man was acquitted by an all-white jury. And so you, as much as anyone, know what was at stake in that moment in time when the sermon was delivered, what sacrifices had been made for the limited gains that had been won. And I wonder if you can just take us back for a moment to that place in history, how you felt, what you believed about the sermon, and what you believe its significance is for us at this moment in time.
Thank you very much. Let me just say before I begin that conversation, let me start another conversation by thanking you very much for the framework that you've offered, the optic that you've given us to really deepen, as Dr. Harding would say, our understanding of the sermon. It's time to break silence. I also would like to thank the staff of Riverside Church, Olive Seminary, and the Veterans of Hope for the prophetic wisdom and vision to gather us in this sister and brother circle 50 years after this sermon to deepen our understanding of this sermon in a society that has been mortally wounded by materialism, racism, and militarism, and might I add to that, heterosexism and misogyny.
Yeah.
It is not by happenstance that we gather in this magnificent edifice 50 years later to really ask a fundamental question that gave birth to the Break the Silence sermon: where do we go from here? Community or chaos? It is important for us as we think about this sermon that we filter it through the quadruple lens of hindsight, insight, foresight, and metasight. Yes. Dr. Martin Luther King and Dr. Vincent Harding had their feet grounded in insight, deeply perceptive with hindsight, and understanding that the record would be everlasting and transcendental. And so it is from this perspective, from this front porch, that we examine this question. I also want to say that Dr. Harding and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King had been a part of a movement that had broken through the Iron Curtain of white supremacy and had turned around a nation, had decimated an empire that had lasted for more than 400 years. And ordinary black people and white people throughout this nation destabilized that empire without firing a shot. As we move forward, Michelle has asked me, what did that time mean? And for me, it was a very important time that challenged my own classism, because I had grown up in a society where I was told that educated people should be the legitimate leaders and the definers of the direction of African American people. The Southern Freedom Movement turned that upside down and set it right again, because it was a Kairos moment where ordinary people like John Hewlett, Fannie Lou Hamer, Miss Devine, Victoria Gray Adams, Ruby Sales had the public microphone. It was a prophetic moment in black church history, where black women in Baptist churches stood in the pulpit and theologically talked about the concept of justice as a spiritual concept. It was an important moment. And not only did it destabilize white supremacy, but it destabilized classism and colorism in the black community. So for a young girl coming from Columbus, Georgia, who was pretty much a rebel, pretty much a wild person in her youth, drinking wine at the pond at Tuskegee, swimming naked with the boys at Tuskegee, and suddenly trying to figure out, because I thought I was a beatnik, so I was trying to find my place in the world. And then I ended up in this class with a woman named Jean Wiley, and she introduced me to James Baldwin. Nobody knows my name. And suddenly I had a name, and it was black. It was woman. And I also got a new religion, and that religion was civil rights. And I went down in Lowndes County, Alabama, and I was a peasant. I didn't know anything about movement history. What I did know is that I had grown up in a society, in a community at Carver High School, where my principal and all of our teachers and everyone in our community told us to aim high. And they told us there had to be a connection between our career and the destiny of our people. And so I was part of a community project that began in 1865 when black men gathered in Selma immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation to pledge their utmost endeavors to educate our youth for the advancement of the race and for the preservation of our rights and liberties. And it was with that spirit that I went to Lowndes County, Alabama, and was deeply moved. Janet Moses is here. She was in Lowndes County with us. Deeply moved by the power of ordinary people, sharecroppers, who in their words didn't know an A from a bullfrog, would shake the foundations and the roots of this nation, would create a spirit, would fertilize and ferment and unleash a spiritual movement in this country that would offer an alternative narrative to empire religion and create a liberating God that was on the side of the poor, a liberating God that set forth for us a call to justice. And I was deeply moved by being a part of that community. And although I was young and didn't really see myself as being a part of that spiritual movement, because every time black people gathered and prayed, I thought they were being ridiculous. I couldn't understand why we couldn't just get down to the business of the meeting. Why did we have to waste everybody's time with all that old-fashioned back-in-the-day stuff? But I began to understand that it was that spiritual grounding that gave black people the courage to be able to face dogs and billy clubs and torture and not be afraid. It was that spiritual grounding that allowed them to say, even in the face of segregation, even in the face of one of the most brutal empires in history, they were able to say, I love everybody. I love everybody in my heart.
You know, Ruby, when we were preparing to meet for this dialogue, we were on a conference call with a number of people involved in the planning, and everyone, including me, kept referring to it as the Beyond Vietnam speech. And you interrupted and you said, no, it's a sermon. And we all said, oh yeah, it's a sermon. And then we kept talking, and then somebody would call it a speech and someone else would call it a speech, and we kept defaulting to calling it a speech. And you interrupted us, I don't know, 3-4 times and said, it's a sermon. And I was struck by that, and I went back and reread the sermon, and I saw why you said that. And I wonder if you would just share a little bit with us now about why you felt it was so critically important to keep at the center an understanding that this wasn't just a political speech, but a sermon calling us to a spiritual revolution, not merely a political one.
Yes. First and foremost, Dr. Martin Luther King said in that sermon that yes, I'm a civil rights leader, but I come to you tonight, he said, as a preacher. And he came before this congregation not only as a preacher, but as a preacher who had been deeply steeped and clothed in black folk theology. It was a theology that began in the bush harbors of sites of terror in this country that have been called plantations. It was a theology that offered an alternative to empire theology that said that God was on the side of white supremacy, a theology that said that God was on the side of materialism, a theology that said that in God we trust as they raised the flag of militarism. It was black people created a theology that was essential to redeem the souls of America. It was a theology that said that I am somebody, that my somebodyness is not rooted in what I own, what I possess, or who I possess. It was an alternative theology in a society of materialism, in a society where genocide had been the calling card of people who called themselves pioneers. It was a society that had birthed and bred the extermination of indigenous people in this country, the Trail of Tears, the breaking up of families. It was a theology that humanized this society. And Americans owe a great deal to black folk theology. So it was this black folk theology that influenced our belief that there was a correlation between justice, the spiritual nature of justice, and democracy. It was a spiritual message because it dealt with our inner and our outer lives as individuals and as a nation. It was a spiritual message because it moved us beyond tribalism to nationhood and universalism. It was a spiritual message because it forced us to not only critique ourselves, but also to look out in the world and critique how we dealt with other people. I think that it's really important as we look at also it was a spiritual message because it put God at the center of our existence. It moved us from white supremacy, where white supremacy is idolatry, where the guardians of white supremacy want us to believe that they are God. They want us to believe that they are the Alpha and Omega of our beginning. They want us to believe that we owe all of our allegiance to them. And most importantly, they want to dismember us. They want us to believe that they gave us our freedom. They want us to believe that we should go out in the world and be foot soldiers on their behalf. And Dr. Martin Luther King cut through all of that and reminded us that we were children of God, of a universal God, and that we were connected across geography, across all of the social divides that separate us in the world. It was a mountaintop spiritual message that called us to a Pentecost moment, that called us to a world house.
And wouldn't you say that it was his spiritual commitment that brought him to break his silence? Because if he were to honor his political commitments, he would have remained silent. He would have done what was politically smart in the moment, which was to stay quiet and to build a relationship on the relationship that he had with Lyndon Johnson, that if he was going to do what was politically wise for him and for the movement at the time, it would not have been to speak out on Vietnam at the time. And instead, it was because he had a higher moral and spiritual commitment that led him to do something that was very much inconvenient for the movement and for the politics of the time.
Well, I think Martin Luther King had always been the inconvenient hero. Mm-hmm. When he stood flat-footed in Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and spoke out against Southern apartheid in a land that had created lynching and castration and rape and enslavement, and dare to go against the grain of that society and to envision a democracy and to preach from the pulpit about this democracy and to talk about it as a justice, as a spiritual call that we should allow to be at the cornerstone of any movement. His movement was not a materialist movement, Michelle, and I think we make a terrible mistake when we make the Vietnam speech to be his defining moment. It was part of an evolutionary process that began the moment he stepped his feet on the pulpit and became a movement leader at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So yes, but it was not at this moment that he was politically...
It wasn't the only moment.
Right,
sure.
He was always out taking positions that went against the political grain. And that was his genius, and that was his relevancy to the moment. Be ye not conformed. He was not conforming to a political norm. Now, Roger Wilkins and people like that were more in line with the political norm, but prophets are always outside of the political norm, because there's not one moment that a prophet is not prophesizing against the empire.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, one of the things, in rereading his sermon that leapt out to me was that it was a challenge really for all of us to break our silences. That we all in our personal lives, in our families, in our communities, in our politics have silences that we ought to break. And it caused me to reflect even in my own life about those times when I have remained silent too long and what it takes to muster the courage to break those silences. Certainly when I chose to write my book, it was an effort to break silence. I was concerned about the silence that existed in the civil rights community as a war on drugs was ravaging poor communities and communities of color and relegating millions of people to a permanent second-class status. And when I finally woke up, I looked around and saw that too many other people were remaining silent as well, and I wanted to find a way to try to break that silence. But in my work, traveling and speaking and talking about mass incarceration and working with communities that have been devastated by mass criminalization, I've come to recognize there are other silences I must break as well.
Yes.
And that there's reasons why we stay silent so long. I had an experience right here at Riverside when I was beginning, well, I guess it was sort of the middle of my own travels with the book, and I gave a speech about the evils of mass incarceration and what must be done. And at the end of my talk, a young man came up to me with a small handwritten note and handed it to me. And I read it, opened it up, and I read the contents inside, and he said something to the effect of, "Dear Sister Michelle, what can we do to support you in speaking the truth about the relationship between mass incarceration, global capitalism, and American empire?" And I was so grateful for the note, not only because he was challenging me and calling me to speak a truth I had known for a while. I need to find a way to speak, but also the way in which he delivered the message. Because there are many ways we can challenge each other. We can challenge each other through criticism and condemnation, or we can say to one another, how can we support you in rising to higher ground? And when I think about Vincent Harding and his relationship to Dr. King, I can see how he was someone who in King's life supported him in rising to higher ground, and being there as someone who could support him in breaking the silences he knew he needed to break. And so I've been thinking about, in the context of this sermon today, what are the silences we need to break now? What are the silences that we need to break 50 years after this sermon? And I certainly believe that in white communities there are certain silences that must be broken. I talk to many white people who say, oh, my family's crazy, half of them are voting for Trump. I said, oh, so what did you say to them? Oh, we don't talk about it. We don't talk politics. That's uncomfortable. There are silences around racism, silences around white supremacy. There are silences in our national community about the wars we're waging abroad. We never see on the evening news American soldiers coming home in their caskets. We never see the bodies of those who are laid waste by drones. And this creates silences that must be broken. And in the Black community, the African American community, I see silences around homophobia, silences around even incarceration today. Say, well, we don't talk about the time he did behind bars. We don't talk about what went on then. We don't talk. So I'm very curious about what you believe are some of the silences that need to be broken. Today, the Trump administration wants to create silence about climate change as American empire gears up to even greater levels of exploitation and extraction of our natural resources and degradation of a planet. There's an attempt to create silence. So what do you believe are the silences that we must break today?
I believe that we must break the silence of revisionist history.
Mm-hmm.
We must be able to make a connection between the world that we are witnessing today and the world that has always been in this country. Mm-hmm. Michelle talked a little bit about her work, the New Jim Crow and mass incarceration. That's a system of containment. And containment existed with mass incarceration, but it's always been a tool of oppression. During enslavement, there was a system of containment. So we have to begin to make a connection. Surveillance is also another important tool of oppression that exists today, that existed during the New Jim Crow, that existed during mass incarceration, that has deep roots in this country. And so oftentimes I hear politicians say, this is not what America is about. And I wonder, what history book have they been reading? Because I think it's important. For example, we see a situation with immigrants today where there's a proposal to break up families. And people step back in absolute horror, as if we'd never been there before. And I'm thinking, don't you understand what happened when people came to this country and unleashed genocide on Native American peoples? Don't you understand what happened when indigenous people's children were taken away from them and put in boarding schools, forced to adapt to a Western culture and leave their own culture behind? Don't you understand when children during enslavement were ripped out of the bosom of their families and were property of men and women who had the option to sell them at whim. This is deep. The fragmentation of relationships and the destruction of community is a very deep imprint on the tracks of white American history. This is not new today.
Preach, girl. Yes.
Somebody tonight talked about napalm, and I'm thinking, yes, that happened in Vietnam, but it also happened on the streets of America during the Southern Freedom Movement when black people were gassed and tear gassed. This country has a long history of chemical warfare against its people. That's not new either. We see evidence of that chemical warfare in leaded water in Flint, Selma, Jackson, Mississippi.
Yes.
My sisters and brothers, that is chemical warfare with biological consequences. So what I think we have to do is to break the silence of our own lies. And we have to begin to speak truth, because it's only by facing America to come to grips with its sordid history that we can begin to continue to bring into being what Vincent Harding calls a nation that is yet to be born. But at the same time, even as we break the silence on that part of history, we must also break the silence on that part of American history that gives us hope. There have always been deviants, whether they were abolitionists, whether they were enslaved people who created the first movement in this country. You're not taught that it was a movement. You call them runaway slaves. But that was a movement. That was the first movement on Southern soil in this country, the runaway slave movement. And so that I think there have always been deviants. There have always been people of color who've been willing to step out and join hands to upbuild democracy in this country. And their stories are as important as the stories of white supremacy, and we must include in those stories not just exceptional people like Martin Luther King, but ordinary people like our grandmothers and our grandfathers and our uncles and our aunts.
Yes. Yes. I'm wondering if you think that one of the silences that needs to be broken revolves around the nature of the change that's required. It seems to me that there has been for a very long time, particularly in civil rights communities, a narrative of progress that revolves around a notion that if only we just keep plodding along on this path that we're on, filing another lawsuit, electing another good Democratic politician, lobbying the right people, that if we just keep doing more of what we have been doing over the last couple of decades, that eventually, kind of we'll get to the promised land. And it seems to me that breaking the silence around the nature of what is required in this moment. And for me, that means being willing to say out loud that we need revolutionary change in this country. And we need, as King said, a revolution that is spiritually grounded, but not in a way that's reduced to a Hallmark card. You know, the phrase revolution of values itself, when divorced from the sermon itself, can sound as though, you know, what King was talking about was, well, we should all just be a lot kinder to one another, that we should just see the good in others and recognize that we're all God's children. And, you know, isn't that a wonderful feeling we ought to have towards one another? And yet when you read through the sermon and you see when he calls for the revolution of values, he actually spends a very long time before he gets to that line in his sermon outlining the ways in which American empire has consistently aligned itself against revolutions, attempted revolutions of poor people and oppressed people who are trying to throw off colonialism and the ravages of capitalism. And again, the United States violently tries to crush those uprisings, aligning itself with brutal dictators. And the revolution that King calls for in that speech is a literal one. He is asking us to align ourselves with the global revolutions that are underway around the world to throw off empire, imperialism, and colonialism. But he's calling then for this revolution to be a spiritually grounded one, a revolution of values, and saying that a true revolution has to have that spiritual component. And I worry that many people embrace the language of King without fully understanding the implications of what he was calling for, that this wasn't a rhetorical revolution, it wasn't a metaphorical revolution. He was asking for the radical restructuring of the political, social, and economic systems in the United States and around the world in a way that would be spiritually and morally grounded.
But I think that it's even deeper than that, because he was asking us to imagine a revolution of values that did not come about with the butt of a shotgun. Mm-hmm. He was asking us to have a new disciplined revolution, a nonviolent revolution, where love would be the calling card and action would be the staple in the revolution. And so that I think that it's really very important for us to as we think about a revolution of values, and as we think about it against the backdrop of the society that we're living in today, we must understand that we're up against some very powerful forces, as exemplified by Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and the global white supremacist culture warriors in the White House. They talk about a Muslim ban, but that's just coded word for a war on black and brown people. I think we're out of time, so I just want to say one closing remark that is really important that I wanted to share with you as you go forward tonight. We are living in very unprecedented times. Yes, we have had presidents who were white supremacists, and yes, we've had congresspeople who were white supremacists, and yes, we've had Supreme Court justices who were white supremacists, but this is the first time in history where we have had card-carrying white supremacists who've captured 3 branches of the government, who have made it very clear that they are going to depopulate this world of black and brown people because of our growing demographics, and that they will use any means necessary to do it. We are in a phase in our society where we must begin to forge a spiritual revolution, where we must begin to reorder our society from the inside out and from the inside in. And we must move from a tribal God to a universal God. And we must stand flat-footed and say that, as Rosemary Harding often said, that this is our country and we won't let the white supremacists have it.
Amen, amen, amen. Friends, we have just a few moments to ask some questions. We have time for about 3 questions. There are folks in the sanctuary with microphones, so make yourself known if you'd like to ask a question. I'd like to respectfully remind everyone that you are asking a very brief question if you get an opportunity to come to the mic. We'll begin with a question that came to us over Twitter. Ruby and Michelle, we've heard you speak so amazingly about the implications of this global revolution that Dr. King called for today. Can you give us our marching orders?
Do you want to?
We can support you as you begin to develop your marching orders. It is not our job to give you your marching orders, because then that would be a hierarchical revolution and not a democratized revolution. So you must meet in groups, you must talk with each other, and you must come together, and you must bring to bear your own thinking and your own knowledge and your own commitment to the question of building up a more perfect union in this country and around the globe.
Amen. 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 All right, we'll start over here with Reverend Bertram Johnson.
I'll let you have this question.
Hi, I'm also a veteran of the civil rights movement, and I do believe that it's possible for us to continue to fight this global white supremacist power structure by using some of the same tactics that we use in the civil rights movement. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Michelle, I'll let you have it.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I think the power of nonviolent civil disobedience is as great today as it was then. And in fact, what we've seen, I think, with some of the movement work that's been done by Black Lives Matter and other organizations and activists around the country, we see that when people take to the streets in a nonviolent way and refuse to cooperate with injustice, you can capture the attention of the world and force a public dialogue that the nation might not otherwise be interested in having. There are countless ways in which, for example, mass incarceration can be thwarted through non-cooperation with injustice. And I won't list them all here now, but
tell us a few.
But for example, there are organizers in Southern California right now who are helping to build support networks so that people can actually insist on their right to trial when arrested for a misdemeanor offense. If everyone who is arrested insists on their right to trial, it will disrupt the system to such a degree that it would be impossible to function. But people need resources and support in developing these kinds of systems of nonviolent civil disobedience. In fact, insisting on your Sixth Amendment right to trial isn't an act of disobedience, it's asserting a constitutional right that you have by law. but there are ways in which we can refuse to cooperate with our systems of injustice. And I think, for example, the sanctuary movement is an excellent example of that, where we are organizing in communities, large and small, to ensure that empire will not have its way in, sweeping in and arresting people and deporting them to countries where they are unsafe and destroying families in those ways. Do you want to add?
Well, I just quickly wanted to add one thing. Intimacy is key to any movement.
Yes.
One of the ways in which empire continues to have power is to separate us from each other and destroy how we know each other, and we become strangers. So movement must be predicated on eye-to-eye organizing. A movement cannot be built on Twitter.
Yes.
It cannot be.
Yes. And I want to add.
And the other thing that we can learn from SNCC and the way we did movement was to let the people decide that any movement with efficacy must build authentic leaders from the ground up. It should not be built around a cult of a hero. It must be built around ordinary people who, once the hero is dead, the ordinary people will be equipped to move forward.
And I would like to add one more point to that, which is that, there is more than one way to vote. In a democracy, I think we've been conditioned to imagine that we have power on a few days maybe out of the year or out of a cycle of years, and that when we show up at the voting booth, that's our chance to have our say. But there's more than one way to vote, and people who are formerly incarcerated and who have lost their right to vote have demonstrated that it's possible to still exercise enormous political power through organizing, through advocacy, through speaking out, through organizing boycotts. We have economic power as well as political power, and I think the time is overdue for us to begin to think more creatively about how we use all the forms of economic, political, and social power that we have.
The intimacy of the movement, that's why religious communities of faith are so important. I just had to get that in there. All right, we have time for one more question right here.
Hi, I want to thank you very much, and also using the word insistence. I like using that word preferably to the word resistance. The question that comes forward to me is, unfortunately, I see a lot of fragmented movements within groups of everyone fighting for their rights based on their histories, with the First People, with people of color. The Hispanic people are very quiet in some respects in this country. So do you have, I'm trying to look towards vision of how we bring unity to each of us, not so much spending so much time on fighting what our history has done to us and moving us forward into a unity of intimacy, like you're saying, and trusting that we know the connections we have are stronger than the connections of the white supremacy.
First of all, movement cannot be separated from history.
Yes.
It is because of our history that we do movement. And so we must be able to create a new paradigm for the 21st century that harmonizes our particular experiences with universality. We must be able to talk about our experiences as African Americans, our experiences as women, our experiences as LGBTQ people. We must be willing to talk about, because once you say to people that history doesn't matter, then what is the foundation of a movement?
Yes.
And so it's not an either or. I do believe that we must begin to imagine new ways and a new language for building movement of the 21st century. We must move away from trite words like white privilege. To be perfectly honest, as a black woman, I'm privileged. So privilege is the wrong word. We must begin to talk about rights, that what we're after are rights, not privilege. We don't want to enjoy the corruptness of privilege. And so that I think that what worries me, not that we talk about our particular histories, but is our inability to talk about the histories of others and to be able to touch our common connections. That's problematic for me.
You know, I have a hard time understanding why the histories of suffering in this nation are experienced as divisive.
As what?
As divisive.
Right.
I want to know the history of indigenous people in this land. I want to know about how people who are called Mexican today lost their land here in the United States.
Yeah.
I want to know that history. I want to know the history of colonialism. I want to know the history of genocide. I want to better understand the varied and rich histories that have brought people to this moment in time. And I think when we try to erase that history or ask people to remain silent about their histories, we actually make the potential of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, egalitarian democracy impossible. It is only by facing our history and opening our hearts and opening our minds to the suffering and the joys and the beauty and the terrors of all people, of all colors, no matter who you are, where you've come from, or what you may have done, that we have any hope of birthing a nation that truly treats all of us as though our lives matter. There is no other way than facing our individual and collective histories if we're going to learn from that history and build a real egalitarian democracy in this country and support the kind of revolutions around the world that I dream of, and I believe many of us dream can be possible.
Well, let me just add one thing. I'm very suspicious when people start saying that, because what they're really saying, they're asking people of color, women, to erase our histories. It's a sly way of wanting us to be invisible, saying that when we speak our histories, then we are dividing the nation. And if we don't speak our history, then whose history will we speak? And so I think we must caution against this tendency to want to erase the histories of people of color and making people of color believe that when we speak our histories, then we are being divisive.
Michelle Alexander and Ruby Sales, thank you so much.
Thank you for doing this with me. You are great.
Our evening will close tonight with a final listen to some words of Dr. King and his amazing world-changing speech. I have 3 short things to tell you as we end. In your program tonight, you will have a card here that gives you information about Holy Week services next week at the Riverside Church. Hope that you will consider joining us. If you feel inspired to do something, which I can't imagine how you wouldn't, please join our neighborhood tomorrow as we march for justice and religious tolerance. We're meeting at Jewish Theological Seminary at noon. Hope to see many of you out there. And if you feel inspired to participate in the work that is going on to heal the lives of those in our community who are most needy, there are ushers who will receive your gift as you're leaving the sanctuary tonight. Finally, hope you'll join our speakers and those of us who are here tonight for a small reception when you exit the nave. Head off to your right into South Hall. We would love to greet you there. And now, as you get ready to go into this world that needs your work for justice and peace, would you pause for just a few moments as we close and hear these words, this call to action.
Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the sons of God, and our brothers wait eagerly for our response. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Will our message be that the forces of American life militate against their arrival as full men, and we send our deepest regrets? Or will there be another message of longing, of hope, of solidarity with their yearnings, of commitment to their cause, whatever the cost? The choice is ours, and though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history. As that noble bard of yesterday, James Russell Lowell, eloquently stated, once to every man and nation comes a moment to decide in the strife of truth and falsehood for the good or evil side. Some great cause, God's new Messiah, often eats the gloom of blight, and the choice goes by forever twixt that darkness and that light. Though the cause of evil prosper, yet 'tis truth alone is strong. Though her portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong, yet that scaffold sways the future. Behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. And if we will only make the right choice, we will be able to transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of peace. If we will make the right choice, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. If we will but make the right choice, we will be able to speed up the day all over America and all over the world, when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.